Hi guys, welcome back to Introduction to Sociology with Dr. John, and it's nice to see you back. And today we're talking about the criminal justice system as a continuation of our discussion of crime, which is a continuation of our discussion of deviance. So, we were talking earlier about who gets involved. So the criminal justice system involves the police. Of course, they're usually the first line of people who are on the street supervising or watching what people are doing, or they're called to events or things that are suspicious. If they arrest somebody or give somebody a ticket or a summons, then it's up to a prosecutor to decide whether or not to prosecute the individual involved. If they decide to prosecute, they will go to court. But keep in mind, only about 20% of cases actually go to court. Most of them are either dismissed for lack of evidence, or there's a negotiation of a guilty plea with the defense attorney. If people then are convicted in court, they may be sent to prison, and this would involve spending time, and that has become a very large institution in American society. Some alternatives to prison, for example, halfway houses, putting people on probation, which literally means they have to prove themselves. They have to demonstrate goodwill. Parole is a similar word for release when people are released early from prison. Parole literally means giving your word that you will not commit another crime or not try to escape the area, or that you will follow conditions. So why do we punish people? Worldwide, there are many different reasons why people might be punished. But the different theories of punishment, for example, you might start with the old biblical one, an eye for an eye, or what you call retribution. So the idea here is that the criminal has done something bad, and we have to punish him to get vengeance, to avenge ourselves against him. But notice in English law, or English common law, which is the law followed in America, it is not the victim who gets to exact punishment. It is the state. And that is not true in all societies. For example, if you are in the Middle East or in some Eastern countries, the victim has the right to decide whether or not the criminal or the accused person is punished. There is a concept called blood money. So for example, if I kill somebody in your family, then the head of your family gets to decide, do I get killed in return? So that's retribution. Or am I allowed to pay a fine or pay some kind of sacrifice in exchange? So very often what might happen is that in order to avoid a feud, they may allow the payment of money, particularly if it was an accident, as opposed to a deliberate murder. Because many of these societies follow not only the retribution system, but retribution also, the problem is it keeps going. If I kill somebody in your family, then somebody in your family kills me, then somebody in my family kills somebody in your family, and the feud keeps going. So in order to avoid that, they allow sometimes payment of money. But this is the point. Something like this in the West is not allowed, because punishment, first of all, is not typically seen as an act of retribution. That is not the purpose of punishment, typically in the West. And if it is, then it is the state which is the one that is injured. So the state has the right to punish you. Anyway, so another theory is deterrence. So deterrence follows rational choice theory, the idea that people choose what they do according to logic, right? So the idea of deterrence is to discourage criminal act through the use of punishment. So, like a parent might say to a child, don't break the window or I'm going to spank you, right? So in doing that, the idea is we want to prevent the crime from happening in the first place by letting people know what the consequences will be. Right? Unfortunately, deterrence depends very much on, first of all, actually punishing people after they commit an act. So it's all very well to say, if you break my window, I'm going to whip you 50 times. But if I never catch you, then you go scot-free, right? So it depends, the amount of deterrence is not only depending on the penalty, but on the likelihood of being caught. And so this creates kind of like a game situation. A lot of criminals think they're so smart they'll never get caught, right? So the deterrence doesn't really affect them. The punishment doesn't affect their judgment, as I should say. And on the other hand, if they do something in a moment of anger, right, then they don't even think about the deterrence. They just do it, right? They're not. If you're really angry, you go and you just do something. You smash something. You punch something, right? So the deterrence doesn't work in those situations either. So deterrence only works in situations where people like thinking about doing a crime, and then they think about what the consequences are, and then they think about what the chances of being caught are, and so at the end of the day, there's a lot of factors involved, and it's unclear to what extent deterrence really prevents people from committing crime. The rehabilitation is another theory behind punishment. In this theory, the idea is that punishment is not so much punishment, but it is a re-education. So if somebody's committed a crime, the assumption is they have, according to a number of the theories we discussed in the previous sections, for example, cultural transmission theory. So these people grew up on the wrong side of the track, let's say. So we need to re-educate them. So rather than punishing them, we put them in a place where they can be re-educated, right? So of course that may be a place of incarceration, but this was a very prominent theory. It still is a prominent theory, although, like I said, in modern day, this, particularly in America, there is some back and forth between retribution, deterrence, and rehabilitation as theories or explanations for punishment. And then finally you have societal protection. So societal protection basically says, look, these people are dangerous, they're going to commit a crime again, so let's lock them up so they just can't do it. Right? So you're protecting society by putting people in prison or by killing them. So in this case, you don't care about rehabilitation, you don't really even care about deterrence. You just want to take dangerous people and put them in jail and keep them there as long as possible. Right? So the question for each of these is, do they work? And what kind of society does it create for us? As we saw at the beginning of the last lecture, where we think about what kind of society are we? Are we an inclusive society? Are we a society that tries to bring people back in? Are we a society that only thinks about punishment? Are we a society that only thinks about putting people outside the system so they can't endanger us? So, and they all imply different things about the criminal. So in the case of the first one, the criminal is, and even the last one, the criminal is seen as somebody, an animal almost, somebody we don't care about. We just want to get our hands on them and do something mean to them. In terms of deterrence, the criminal is a logical person we're trying to reason with, perhaps, and also rehabilitation. So in the United States, in general, deterrence and rehabilitation have usually been the main justification for punishment. In the past, however, retribution and societal protection were much more common, and this is still true, as I said, in many areas of the world. So, for example, under Islamic law, retribution is still a very important aspect of the punishment system. Still, despite all of this, the United States has some of the highest rates, in fact, the highest rate of incarceration in the world. So this is the rate per 100,000. So the United States has 655 people per 100,000 in prison, which is a massive number. You look at the closest country is El Salvador, which, if you've ever been to El Salvador, it is a country racked by gang crimes at this time. So as well as civil war. It's been in civil war for 30 years. Rwanda, another country with a high level of civil war. Russia, where you think, again, a high level of oppression, the communist regime. But we beat them all. We've got more than any of these countries. And you look at some countries like India, only 33 per 100,000. So how does India deal with crime in a different way? Sweden also very low, Denmark very low, Germany. So you look at most of the countries in Europe tend to have a much lower rate of incarceration. One argument or one explanation for this is that in the United States, several recent phenomena have massively increased the level of incarceration. So two of these are the war on drugs and the quote-unquote war on crime. The war on drugs started in the 1980s primarily with the explosion of cocaine and other drug sales in primarily inner-city neighborhoods. One phenomenon of this was crack cocaine. Crack is a drug that is very debilitating, and it's a smokable form of cocaine. So it's not different chemically from cocaine, but it's very different in its effect, because when it's smoked, it's like speed. It goes straight into the bloodstream through the lungs, right? And therefore has immediate and very powerful effect, as opposed to cocaine, which normally is snorted, although freebasing is similar to crack. But if you snort cocaine, it goes through the nose. It takes quite a while to get into the bloodstream, and pretty soon your nose gets all blocked up, so it limits the effect. But if you're smoking crack, it goes straight into your lungs, has immediate effect. You can hype it up or keep going pretty much constantly. So the result is that people will be on crack. They go, as they say, on a mission. I'm going to go on a mission. I got some money, got me some crack. And they may be gone 3-4 days on a mission, and then they collapse because at that point they haven't slept for 2-3 days, and then they will sleep for a day or two. And these people are generally incapable of working, or generally incapable of any, at that point, any responsible membership in society. They become completely addicted to that experience of up and down. So it's very, very debilitating. In any case, the point is, in the 80s, despite the fact that a lot of this crack cocaine was promoted, according to some arguments, by massive cocaine imports from Central America, assisted by the Central Intelligence Agency, the fact is that the government then announced a crackdown on it. It was the Reagan administration, and the idea was that this was a way they could get reelected by claiming that they were going to solve this problem. And so massive numbers of people started being thrown in both state and federal prison and jails also for drug offenses. And one of the arguments was that because crack was more potent than cocaine, even a small amount of crack would generally get people a very long prison sentence compared to amounts of cocaine. So, for example, if you were carrying half a kilo of cocaine, then you would be considered a dealer, and you'd be punished as a dealer, that you had it for trafficking. On the other hand, only 5 grams of crack was enough to be prosecuted for a dealer if you had crack. Right? So 5 grams of crack is a very small amount. So this created a huge disparity, particularly in inner city neighborhoods where crack sales were far more prevalent than cocaine sales. At the same time, a number of laws were passed increasing penalties, and there was a very controversial law passed in the 90s under the Clinton administration. One part of it was a 3 strikes, you're out. So basically it said, if you're convicted of 3 felonies, on the 3rd felony conviction, you get a life sentence. So people may have had a felony, like they stole a loaf of bread, literally, or they stole a small amount of money. That would be considered a felony. And very often they wouldn't even go to court. They would plea bargain. Then when it was their 3rd case, again, it might be a small thing. It might be a loaf of bread. It might be a TV set. But they would be facing life in prison. So this created a huge increase of the number of people serving life sentences. In 1984, as you can see here, you had 34,000. So 2016, we had 162,000 people in America serving a life sentence. Right? So normally, in the past, life sentences were only reserved for like murders, typically even multiple murders or grievous murders. Now you had all these people with minor felonies, even drug cases, many of them drug cases, and being put in prison for life. Partly you'd say, how do we rehabilitate people if they're in prison for life? And secondly, how do we pay for it as a society? So the number of prisons have increased so much. For example, many states are now spending more on prisons than they are on higher education. So race has become a factor for several reasons. First of all, because of the inherent bias in the system. A lot of these laws impact African Americans and to a certain extent Hispanics far more than whites. So as I talked about before, the attack or the higher sentences for holding crack cocaine as opposed to cocaine meant far more African Americans were being prosecuted as dealers because they were in the inner city neighborhoods. Crack cocaine was cheaper, so poorer people tended to be African American. Right? In the more elite middle class areas, they were snorting cocaine, which is more expensive in terms of its effect, but they could afford it. So when they were arrested, they would only be charged with possession as opposed to distribution. So and then there's a series of other factors we can go into. But for example, general bias. So when you look at a police officer on the street, he may not know he's biased, but the reality is they're far more likely to arrest African Americans than they are to arrest white people. And that, again, may be interacting with issues of income and poverty. But even wealthy African Americans have many stories to tell about being stopped, right? Even as they walk around their own neighborhoods, because the police officers will be like, "What are you doing in this neighborhood? You're black. You're not supposed to be in a rich neighborhood." Right? So this bias inherently affects and increases the number of African Americans who are stopped, increases the number who are then arrested. Then it goes into the court system. And again, here primarily it's more a matter of money. So if you have a good lawyer, you're much more likely to get off. If you rely on the public prosecutor, the public defender, they're much more likely to essentially negotiate a plea deal. Right? And as we just saw, a plea deal may lead to agreeing to a lower level felony, which may say, okay, you get to walk out, but now you've got 1 count towards your 3 counts and you're out. So all the way down the line, the racial biases and also income biases that make a huge difference in terms of who ends up being in prison. And typically, we've seen the population of African Americans increase much faster than the population of whites and even Hispanics. This is an interesting graph, because when you look at this graphic, you see here's the number of white people in prison, or the percentage of people in prison who are white versus the percentage who are non-white in 1950. And you see in 1950, the percentage of people who are white is about 2/3 of the prison population. So non-whites were slightly more represented than in the general population, because in the general population in 1950, about 85% of the population were white, and as we can see, about 65% of the prison population is white. However, when you look at the picture here, 2010, almost 70%, certainly 2/3 of the prison population is now non-white. And less than 1/3 of the prison population is white. And population hasn't changed that much. And now, basically, whites are about 70% of the general population. Non-whites are about 30%. But now we see non-whites 3, 4, 5 times more likely to be in prison. Now, again, there are a number of different factors. Racial bias is definitely one of these. Income and the ability to get a good lawyer is another one. Another one is rural versus urban. So when you see these disparities, it's often in urban areas that you see the biggest disparities, because that's where more people are being arrested. Right? So there's a lot of different factors involved, but race is definitely a factor. And as you can see, race has become even more important of a factor in the criminal justice system. You might say, why? Why is race more important now than it was in the 1950s, when you had Jim Crow and overt racism in many parts of the country? Does this mean racism getting worse? Very possibly. Or it could mean that the criminal justice system is being used to create a racist structure. Certainly it creates a lot of questions about the relationship of policing and race in American society. So in general, let's ask why crime is so high, or at least why are there so many people in prison? And in general, the fact is, a lot of crimes are much higher in the U.S. than they are in other countries. We have much higher murder rates than most other countries, much higher rates of assault, of violent crime, as well as property crime. I live in the Middle East, for example, and property crime and most assaults and violent crimes are virtually non-existent compared to the West. So why is it so much higher in the U.S. compared to Europe, compared to the Middle East, compared to even the Far East? So, a couple theories. So, remember the theories we talked about before. Functionalism. Right? Remember, functionalism says we have to have solidarity, and that means having a high level of cultural unity. But the reality is the United States is a very diverse country. So perhaps the diversity leads to deviance, or more deviance in crime, because people see other people as very different. So they may misunderstand them. Again, when we talk about race and policing, that is a very distinct possibility that people from different ethnic groups may be misunderstood or may misunderstand each other's intentions, and this contributes to the type of tension that exists in the community. Again, according to functionalism, you have Merton's theory. of structural strain. So the argument here is that the values, we have these values or goals which are very high in America. We believe anybody can become rich, anybody can become president, anybody can be successful. Just read my book and you'll be successful too. But in reality, it's very hard to attain for most people. So again, this would explain why there is a higher level of deviance and crime in America. Turn to symbolic interactions, and remember this is about how people see things and construct things. And again, we would go back to cultural diversity. Since people misunderstand each other, people from other ethnic groups, it becomes very likely higher tendency to label people who are from particularly minority groups. These people get labeled, and then it becomes very difficult for them to become accepted back in society again. Control theory. Control theory is the one conservatives like very much, because basically it says that lack of order, lack of law and order leads to a lack of control. When you have a lack of control, sometimes they call this the broken windows theory. That, for example, you go into a neighborhood and if people see broken windows or they see it's in decay, they don't care about the neighborhood anymore. But if somebody goes in and imposes order and fixes everything and keeps it fixed, then people will have more pride in their neighborhood. So again, this kind of goes back to the Durkheimian concept of rules and the need for norms and rules and regulation. Right? So control theory is the more conservative side of Durkheim, saying we need to control people's activity. Essentially, that's what people want. So we need more police, more regulation, or more control, particularly in poor or minority areas. Again, we talked about the baby boom, and this is another explanation, because remember we talked earlier about how younger people who are teenagers, tend to commit more crime. And when you look at the rise of crime in America, it very much follows the significant increase of teenagers and young people in the baby boom generation. And as that generation grew older, then the crime rate went down. So a big chunk of at least the increase in crime could be explained by the baby boom. Now, there are other explanations. So as I said, crime has been steadily decreasing since the 1990s. It could be because the baby boomers are getting older and no longer going out and beating people up, me, right? It could be changes made. So, for example, more community policing. In the 70s and 80s, a lot of police departments went into decline. Inner city areas went into decline. So it could be a combination of these things. Maybe having better control, closer control, community policing, and putting more policemen on the beat has often been attributed or been an explanation for the decline in crime. Again, another thing is, of course, the economy. If people have full-time jobs, first of all, they don't need to commit crime, and secondly, they don't have as much time to commit crime because they're working, right? And when they're not working, they want to spend their money doing something, right? So they don't have time to rob people or beat people up or even get into fights. The drug trade, again, as that has declined, that has also cut down on the secondary impact of drug-related crime. And of course, general demographics, the end of the baby boom, as we discussed before. But this is a paradox. Even though we've had a drop in crime, we still have this increase in the federal prison population. If you look at the drop in crime, it started really in the 1990s here. So the crime rate started to decline there, but the criminalization still went ahead. So criminalization was put in as a solution to the crime problem, but the crime problem was already solving itself. So we have this push of pushing people into prisons which doesn't seem to make any sense from any legal point of view or another. So let's clarify again, back to the issue of race and minorities and other types of biases in the criminal justice system. First of all, as I said before, when the police come into a situation, they are much more likely to end up arresting men and minorities. And again, that may be due to overt racism, it may be due more to cultural misunderstanding, because the police are generally going to be from a middle class background. Many of the people involved in the situation may be from a lower class background, whatever their race. Secondly, access to lawyers and bail. Wealthier people are much more likely to have access to private lawyers or money for bail. Poor and minorities, because again, the disparity of minorities who are poor are going to not have that type of access. Therefore, they're going to be forced into the system of the public defender, if that, and they will generally be forced to make a plea bargain, because the fact is public defenders' offices are massively overworked. They don't have the kind of funding, because at the end of the day, no politician's ever going to get reelected based on how much they gave to the public defender's office and how much they care about the rights of suspects. This is unfortunate, right? But effects of trial, again, once they're in the criminal justice system, again, if they're poor and minority, they're much more likely to be seen as deviants and therefore criminals by juries. And then sentencing. As we discussed before, the three strikes law has had a huge impact, particularly again on the poor and minorities. So when you go into prison, you look at who's had 3 strikes, who is in a life sentence, you see almost entirely poor and minorities in that category. They, like I said before, they may have pleaded guilty to small felonies, but then this third thing, no matter how big it is or small it is going to require a huge sentence. You've got cases, people are in prison for shopkeeping or for minor drug charges, and they're in prison for life. And remember, this is a multiplier effect. So, for example, if you're twice as likely to be arrested because of your poverty or race, then you're also twice as likely to end up going to court because you don't have money for bail or to get your case dismissed, right? So that's twice as likely times twice as likely is 4 times as likely. And if you're twice as likely to be found guilty because of the effect of trial bias, right now twice as likely times twice as likely times twice as likely is 8 times as likely, right? So we start to see why there is such a disparity in the number of people in prison of poor and minority background. And then the point is, you have to go back and say, is this serving society's interests? Is this why we have a prison system, in order to disproportionately punish poor people and minorities? So when you look at, for example, the lifetime likelihood of imprisonment of U.S. residents, this is people born in 2001, so these are the millennial generation. Right? So when you look at all men, that means each man has a 1 in 9 chance of going to prison. 1 out of 9. For white men, it's 1 out of 17, which is a much lower percentage. Right? Basically, half as much as the general proportion. But for black men, it's 1 out of 3. It's a huge proportion. It means 1 out of every 3 African American men will end up spending some time in prison during their life. For Latino men, it's 1 out of 6. When you look at women, women are much less likely to end up in prison. Is it because they commit less crime, or again, because women are often seen as the victims or the innocents? So again, there's a huge amount of debate about that. The fact is, men are much more likely to be involved in violent crimes and property crimes than women are. Men, and this may go back to the idea that men are supposed to provide for the family, so they're the ones who are held, pushed more to criminal activity. It may also be because women find it, well, for women it's much easier to get welfare or to get support from the government or from charities, because again, as women, they're seen as more innocent and more defenseless. And I'm not going to say one thing or the other, but there is a very real situation in terms of how people are seen in terms of gender also with this respect. So I hope that didn't make you too depressed or unhappy, but this is the reality of life in our country. We don't always have the best situation in every regard. And again, one of the goals of sociology is to help see how we can improve our social situation. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll see you back in the next lecture, which will be the beginning of section 4.